Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper, and I'm on my way to the grocery store. I'm heading over there just to grab a couple things, and I started thinking about how quickly this whole SHTF thing can happen and how quickly the worst of it actually shows up. And we're actually being shown a lot of that evidence right now based on these current conflicts. And there's a lot we should learn from what's happening, especially in the Middle East right now, based on anything you might need to apply to your survival and your preparedness planning, because the timeline over there is actually very concerning, and it just goes to show you how quickly a full-on collapse can be experienced. Now, I do want to mention that Midway USA is the biggest supporter of the channel, and of course, thanks to them, I can put content out like this and then apply it to any practical preparedness equipment requirements in my planning. So a big thanks to Midway USA. Now, Israel began their siege on Gaza on November 2nd of 2023, right? So 4 months ago. Now, here's the thing. I'm not here to talk about any of the politics or any of the justifications involved with that entire conflict. We're only going to talk about what the people within Gaza are experiencing right now and how we can apply that to our preparedness planning, okay? So in 4 months, Gaza as a city has become uninhabitable. It's basically not able to support the population that it currently has. And that is obviously problematic based on how they were before this war even started. But in all reality, in 4 months' time is all it took for an entire city of people to suddenly not be able to sustain life in their environment. That's very fast, okay? Before the war, about 2/3 of Gazans were dependent on food aid of some sort in order to eat, right? So that's a huge portion of the population. Like, for example, about 12.5% of the US population is currently on food stamps, but that's still a large percentage of the population. And just keep that in mind, because in that 4 months, that 2/3 of Gazans who are reliant on food aid in order to not be facing starvation is now 100%. The entire population of Gaza is now 100% dependent on aid for their food, right? So even if we just said, okay, well, that's an additional, 33% of the population, let's just say, well, add that to the 12.5% of the US population that's currently in need of aid when it comes to food, and you're talking about, almost half of the population suddenly requiring aid in order to survive if the whole country was to face something similar, right? Which is, I know, unlikely, but it's still something to consider that this is all happening within a 4 month period of time. Now, this can be blamed on a lot of things. There's a lot of speculation as to, what's actually happening in Gaza. And there's a lot of people saying that, Israel is only allowing like half of the amount of food trucks into Gaza compared to what was allowed in prior to the siege and everything else. But that's just what's being said. And just so you're aware, like, this is siege warfare. Now, one thing that could insulate you from some of this is some sort of, rural setting, because it's very hard to wage siege warfare on a bunch of unincorporated land, right? It's much easier to do it to a city where there's a dense population. So if you live in a major metropolitan area, you should definitely be paying attention to what's happening there right now, because one of the reasons why this is even possible is because it's this small area that's easily corralled and a giant population there within that's requiring all the resources to survive, right? So, and that's very similar to what we saw in, medieval siege warfare when it came to the siege of castles and the populations being drawn in behind the walls and everything else, right? So there's a lot you can apply to your situation if you're in a major city, especially one of a large population, and understand that this could happen to your city, because Israel's showing just how it can be done. Now, of course, the circumstances around Gaza are very individual when it comes to the way that the city is laid out, the density of it, the ability to flow in and out of the city is highly restricted in comparison to, an American city, but it's just something for you to be aware of and pay attention to. And if relocation was part of your preparedness plan, this could be another reason as to why you might want to do that. And obviously, siege warfare is very effective, and it's very detrimental for those who are within the besieged area. But at the same time, don't forget, like, just because the likelihood of a foreign military coming to your city and laying siege upon it is very low, well, that doesn't mean it has to be a foreign military, right? It also doesn't necessarily mean it has to be of a singular country. It could be a conglomerate of countries, something like similar to an entity that unites a lot of nations. So there's a lot of things that could happen that could emulate something that we're witnessing over there right now. Like I said, 4 months this has been going on. And in 4 months, now we have disease running rampant. Okay. We have people having to share very small amounts of space and very tight enclosures with very little access to hygiene. So we have, in some places, up to 500 or so people sharing one singular toilet, right? And that's easily perceived to be a possibility if something similar were to happen in any other major metropolitan area. And because of that, disease is running rampant. And just for a baseline example of something that takes a lot of people out in any survival situation, diarrhea in children in Gaza right now is up 2,000%. And of course, with the lack of nutrition, the lack of clean drinking water access, and the lack of hygiene, that diarrhea can be fatal. It's not something that's just easily overcome in those conditions. And of course, they have a lack of shelter going on there as well. That's leading to more sickness being spread and people's immune systems being downtrodden. And we also have things being used to generate heat because it's very cold there, and especially at night, and these people don't have sufficient shelter. So in order to maintain warmth, they're burning toxic fuel basically because they're burning whatever they can get their hands on in order to not freeze. But that also leads to things like upper respiratory infections and everything else. And like I said, this is all only happening within the last 4 months, right? And just because 100% of the population is now reliant on some sort of aid in order to eat, well, that doesn't mean 100% of the population is actually still capable of eating. So now 26% of the population in Gaza are considered starving, literally in the current process of starvation, all within a 4 month period. So in 4 months, a lot can happen. And this is why, yes, here on this channel, we talk a lot about gear and equipment and of things that I personally enjoy. Why? Because I have a passion for it and I can deep dive into that subject in a very, very, let's just call it extra way. But this reminds you and should remind everybody that food is still a priority. Hygiene is a priority. Medicine is a priority. And access to shelter and fuel is a priority. And what's happening in Gaza right now, of course, there's fighting going on. And of course, there are those who are within militant groups that are currently involved in the conflict there. But the majority of the population is trying not to starve, trying not to freeze, trying to overcome some sort of sickness, and trying to figure out where they're going to sleep that night, right? Which is why all those things should still be a number one priority for you. And if you don't have anything in regards to those vital preps, then that's something you should definitely be trying to set a goal for throughout this year as well as just right now. Because there's no guarantee that something like this couldn't happen just because it's what's happening in the Middle East, right? Just because you live in the United States, or maybe you live in the UK or Australia or Canada or wherever else you might live, there's no guarantee you won't face something like that ever in your lifetime, right? And right now, the people of Gaza, even if they had some of those preparations ready, and even if they had access to some of those things prior to the siege, doesn't mean they were able to take it all with them, right? It doesn't mean they had everything they owned on their backs when they were suddenly displaced, especially when there are bombs dropping. So you have to be able to adapt as well. But you better have a plan for how you're going to eat, how you're going to drink, how you're going to not have diarrhea, because all it took was 4 months in Gaza, which, yes, was already facing its level of humanitarian crisis, right? We all know that. But what I'm trying to say is in 4 months, a city that was at least somewhat operational and had some level of living conditions is now literally being considered uninhabitable. That's not very long. So maybe you should plan for, at a minimum, 4 months of preparedness when it comes to your pantry or when it comes to your water storage. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what your situation is or what you're capable of, but use these examples we have access to now to better your situation and learn from it as best you can. because history is a great teacher. And right now we're living through history. So we need to take any information we can from it and then apply it to hopefully make our survival situation much more improved. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Do you think that a 4-month timeline is considered fast? Do you think that it is something you should prepare for now based on what we're witnessing? Or do you think that it's only legitimate because of the particular details surrounding that environment before all of this even happened? I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but there is something worth talking about, at least in my opinion. Anything else at all you need from me, go to magicprepper.com. And besides that, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.